Hello and welcome to Faith Matters. My name is Keith Hitchman, and this is the show where we take a spiritual perspective on life and culture across Merseyside. It's great to be back with you again after my 3-month sabbatical. Many thanks to Laura Pasterfield, my colleague, who's been presenting the programme over the last 3 months. And this is the 50th episode. We're here once again at St James's House, the headquarters of the Diocese of Liverpool. And our guest today is Ian Simpson, who is the Heritage Officer for the Diocese. Welcome to Faith Matters, Ian, and thank you for welcoming us once again to the diocesan offices. Firstly, what is heritage? I mean, I did a environmental studies degree, and we did a whole module, if I remember, on heritage. And right at the beginning, I remember nobody really knew what it was. So can you tell us, tell our viewers what heritage is?
Yeah, I think if you mention heritage to 10 people, 9 of them will automatically think old buildings. And it is partly about old buildings, but it's more than that. It's about the value of places, and it's about the value of the stories of the people who make up those places. With churches specifically, I'd say it's very much about the story of the people of faith who've brought that community of faith through often very difficult times, and how that place of worship has interacted with and helped shape its community.
Okay, so as a heritage officer for the diocese, what exactly is it that you do on a day-to-day basis? What is your job?
Well, there really are no 2 days that are the same, which is one of the things I really love about the job. But in its essence, it's a sort of balancing act, almost like a tightrope act. Because on one side, you've got the heritage considerations, you've got the need to protect and preserve the particularly listed buildings, often which have some particularly very old, very interesting artefacts in them, very fragile stained glass windows. And on the other hand, you've got the need to make those buildings fit for mission, fit for purpose in the 21st century. And so on a day-to-day basis, this can be anything from securing funding applications. I spend a lot of time helping churches write grant applications. It can be about explaining how to maintain buildings. There's a lot people can do to stop them from falling into disrepair. It's about helping them negotiate the ecclesiastical planning process, because of course in the church we have our own faculty jurisdiction, so any changes need special permission. And then I also advise on things like church tourism, getting churches open, using churches to their maximum potential, really releasing them back for the purpose they were intended.
Great. And so how long have you been doing this job, and what is your background? Have you always done this kind of thing, or as a profession, or is this something you've come into later on in life?
Yeah, well, I've been in this post now for just over 3 years. I'm on a second 3-year contract now, and largely funded by Historic England. Now, prior to that, really the bulk of my career has been in the construction and building maintenance industry. And I worked for one particular large company up until 2012 when I was made redundant. And during that time, I worked on a number of projects, both on modern new build projects, PFI schools and so on, and on some really old, interesting buildings. And I really preferred working with the old, interesting buildings.
Yeah.
And the other thing I learned from that was the sort of financial side of things. Putting together a maintenance contract bid, in essence, is not that much different from writing a grant application. So, in a sense, I mean, it's almost God's leading in a way that's sort of brought me through these different stages of my career to really use it all now in this one role.
Now, some people I know, in certain wings of the church say, well, we don't need church buildings. We can, I come from a tradition for at least part of my life where, we rented sports halls for church and that kind of thing. But, to your mind, why are church buildings so important?
There are really a number of reasons why church buildings are incredibly important. First of all, They are out there doing mission. They are working for the faith. They're proclaiming the faith 24/7, 365 days a year. Even when there's nobody around, they are speaking of the community of faith that those buildings represent. And by extension, they're proclaiming God. And that can be a bad thing as well if you've got a church that's locked for 6.5 days a week and it's got blood rain out of the gutters and it looks like it's derelict. Then that is speaking really not of an open and welcoming Christian community, is it? But where you've got a well cared for building that's obviously looked after, a lot of people use it, a lot of people in the community care for it, that really does speak, I think, very well of Christianity and Christian faith. Next, in many communities, they're the only large community meeting spaces, the only large community buildings. You get this particularly in rural communities, but a lot of inner city communities as well. The pubs have closed, the banks have closed, the post office has closed, but the church is there, and that building is there. I can think of areas in this diocese where literally the church is the last public facility standing. And I think finally there is the sort of heritage issue. If you think that more than half of all the Grade 1 listed buildings in this country are churches, they're a very important record of not just the architectural developments and so on over history, but also our Christian roots, the way that Christianity has shaped the history of this nation, its laws, its culture, and they're a very important reminder to us of that. We must not lose sight of those Christian roots in our heritage.
Interesting, but we're seeing, aren't we, that all around us, for the last 20 or 30 years, really, churches shutting, chapels and churches shutting, like you said, falling into disrepair, the budlier, the overgrown gardens, aging congregations finding it hard to keep up with that kind of maintenance, the huge cost of keeping a building like that, a church building going, church roofs and so on. All those kind of issues. We're seeing, like I said, churches shutting, churches falling into disrepair. What is the diocese of, what is the Church of England or the church generally across the country doing? What is the Diocese of Liverpool doing specifically to address these kind of problems, and what kind of difficulties are there? Huge question.
It is a huge question. And I mean, first of all, I would say that church closures, certainly in the Church of England and in this diocese in particular, are not that frequent. Because we're the established church, there is quite a long-winded and bureaucratic procedure we have to go through in order to close the church. So it's very, very much a last resort. And where it does happen, it's usually happened because the congregation has moved away from an area, it's been depopulated. I mean, if you think back in the 1970s, the so-called slum clearance programme, all the high-density housing was cleared. A lot of churches were lost then, but that's because the whole communities were torn down. So these days it's actually quite rare for a church to close. It happens occasionally because the congregation moved away, as I say, or if structural problems become completely beyond economic repair. And we've got one or two cases of those on in the diocese at the moment, but it isn't that common. What is the diocese specifically doing about it? Well, first of all, since I've been in post, I've actually raised or helped raise over £3 million towards the repair costs for a number of churches. And if you go to St Bridget's Wavertree, for instance, Holy Trinity in Parmount, St Helens, Emmanuel in Southport, St Cuthbert's in Halsall, just as examples, they've all got scaffolding on at the moment because there's some of that £3 million is being spent on urgent repairs to those churches. And that's £3 million worth of economic activity going on in those parishes that wouldn't otherwise happen. So that's a very important side of what we're doing. But we're also involved in training parishes up so that they don't let their church buildings get to that state where they need that kind of intervention. I run a number of maintenance training programmes, usually about 4 a year in different places across the diocese, and they are open to not just every church in the diocese, but in fact any church of any denomination is more than welcome to come along and learn some simple tips, what to look out for and how to spot trouble before it becomes serious. We're also going to be launching a diocesan gutter maintenance scheme in the next few months, and that will allow churches to have access to discounted contractors who will come and clear out the gutters probably twice a year. Again, that will be open to churches of all denominations. And that is, actually, if I can get one message across, the simplest one thing you can do to stop your church falling into disrepair is keep the gutters cleared out.
Well, Ian, thank you very much for this half of the programme. We're going to go now to our commercial break. But you were saying that these courses that you're offering, they are for not just for Anglicans, not just for the Church of England, but other denominations can come.
For anybody at all who cares for a church building.
Excellent. Okay, well, we'll come back to talk about your personal faith a bit and how it relates to your job after the commercial break. Join us after the break for Faith Matters. Hello and welcome back to Faith Matters with me, Keith Hitchman, the show where we take a spiritual perspective on Merseyside life. We're with Ian Simpson, who's the Heritage Officer for the Diocese of Liverpool. We were in the break, actually, we were talking about how the church restoration work that the diocese is doing is keeping traditional builders and traditional building skills going. Can you just comment on that briefly before we go to our next?
Yes, of course. It's something that I'm really quite proud about in a way, because the traditional skills, things like lime mortar pointing, they were on the brink of dying out some years ago, because obviously modern techniques were superseding them. A lot of modern techniques and modern materials don't work on ancient buildings, and there's been a revival in the craft skills, things like traditional leadwork, for instance, traditional roofing techniques, and that is really good to see. And there are young people actually coming in now and doing apprenticeships in traditional stonework and things like that. It's really good, really exciting to see.
So that's the church is contributing to the economy and to the community.
Absolutely,
in this way. That's great. That's
absolutely,
really...
and of course, a lot of these traditional materials are so much more sustainable and require so much less energy to produce.
Well, Ian, this role you have is, is part administrative, would you say, and part kind of practical?
Yes, yeah. That's true.
Is that how you might describe it?
Yeah, I mean, there is quite a bit of paperwork involved, especially when it comes to grant applications. They can be very sort of paperwork intensive.
Okay, but you're also a person of faith. And I know that's partly your motivation. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about that, about how your faith impacts this role and how the two intersect? Yeah,
I mean it has a huge impact, really. I mean, I can't imagine doing this particular job if I didn't have the faith in the first place. I think in practical terms, on a day-to-day basis, there's a sort of guiding vision there, which is that these church buildings were built for the glory of God. Obviously, as a Christian, I want to glorify God, and if you like, the talents and the skills that God has given me to use in His service are around maintaining and caring for and repairing, particularly historic buildings, but modern ones as well, of course. And so I feel this is a great opportunity to use those talents in His service, and as I think I said before, I've sort of felt that almost I've been led through my career to this role. And on a day-to-day basis, we get all sorts of obstacles and hurdles thrown at us. I mean, finance is the big one, and sometimes you have got to just have faith that if this is God's plan, well, at the end of the day, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, and He will provide what's necessary for it to go through, whether that be the money or whether that be support from the community or whatever.
And are you finding in places, city and rural, urban and rural context, that the wider community, say, is coming together to help a church when it runs into difficulty building-wise? Does that kind of thing happen? Or
in some cases it does, yes. I mean, a very, very good example is Holy Trinity Paramount in St Helens, where it's an absolutely unique church. It's the only parish church in the country that's completely built out of copper furnace slag, So it's built out of industrial waste, basically. But it's in one of the more deprived parts of the diocese. And when it was threatened with closure, there was an absolutely huge response from the community, and a sort of multi-disciplinary group made up of, obviously there's the church, the diocese, but the St Helens Council got involved, the local housing association, Helena Partnerships, got involved, the FINTRA, Tenants and Residents Association, got involved, and there was a real coming together, and that church has now been almost like a phoenix rising from the ashes. There's a building repair programme has gone along in conjunction with a programme of community activities, and that building's really getting used again.
That's great. Now, when we were chatting through, preparing this programme and the research sort of stage, you were telling me that Pokemon Go could be giving church buildings and church property a whole new lease of life. Tell us how that's going to work.
Well, I never thought I'd live to see an email headed, "Is your church a poke stop?" But in all seriousness, this is a big phenomenon. A lot of people are playing Pokemon Go, and it's getting them out of their houses, into the environment, and looking around, which is obviously really good. And a lot of these Pokemons that they're looking for are in or around churches. So they're coming into our churches, they're coming into our churchyards. And this is great, but really all they're looking for is these virtual monsters that don't exist. Now, what we've got in the church is a lot of very interesting stuff that does exist, and some of it is real monsters. If you look at the gargoyles, for instance, at Wigan Parish Church, or at All Saints Chilwell, if you look at the medieval wood carvings at Holsall Parish Church, these are some really quite monstrous images, but they're real. They've been there for hundreds of years in many cases. So what we need to do is take this opportunity and say, well, yes, you're very welcome, come in and look for Pokemon, but while you're here, look up and see what we've got. And even if you haven't got monsters, it's a great opportunity to invite people in, be hospitable to them, and really use the building, use whatever you've got there just to gently lead them towards Christ.
Interesting, that's fascinating. Now, Liverpool has some great, as a city, has some great historic churches. And as you were speaking there, I was thinking, we did a programme recently at St James's in the city, in which, Neil Short, the vicar there, was, showing us all the memorials connected with the slave trade, which is obviously part of Liverpool's darker kind of history, but part of its history nonetheless. And he was saying that he wanted to keep these memorials because people need to be reminded of where the church perhaps went astray in the past, and didn't exactly follow Christ's teaching. And but tell us, you might want to reflect on that, but tell us about some of the historic buildings that we have in Liverpool that people can go and see even.
Well, as you say, we've got a lot of buildings in Liverpool which are worth seeing. And with the forthcoming Heritage Open Days, of course, in September, you'll get a chance to visit some churches that you wouldn't normally get a chance to see. But some of the better ones, we think St Peter's Woolton is a highly topical one as well, because next year is going to be the 50th anniversary, of course, of John Lennon and Paul McCartney meeting actually in that church's church hall. But the church is going to organise a lot of celebratory events for that. But even now, it's part of the Beatles tour, and it's got the grave of Eleanor Rigby.
And Paul and John, of course, was in the choir there, wasn't he? And or he was in the youth club at least. I think. But he attended, didn't he, with Mimi?
Yes, I'm
going all over the place.
I think so. This is a bit before my time, Keith.
Yeah, and mine, obviously.
Of course, yes.
Yeah.
But if you want a very different experience of that church, go on a summer evening just as it's starting to go dark, and you'll see the sandstone lit up the most glorious orange colour, and then as it goes darker, the bats come about in the churchyard. It's really quite magical. So it's a wonderful building to go and see. In the city centre, we've got Our Lady and St Nicholas, the Liverpool Parish Church, which for hundreds of years has been a beacon to homecoming seafarers.
Even shaped like a ship, isn't it?
Even shaped like a ship, yes. And it's a wonderful, wonderful building, very interesting building with a fascinating history. And it's a bit of a shame that it's been so overdeveloped around these days. It's not as conspicuous as it was, but it's still very much worth seeing. I suppose I've got to put a plug in for my own church, which is St Agnes in Toxteth Park. A very beautiful interior designed by John Loughborough Pearson, who designed Truro Cathedral, which I know is a part of the world you're very familiar with. But it's almost like a small-scale version of Truro Cathedral.
Really? No, I've never been in there. I'll have to come.
Oh, you must. Well, I'll be
as a
delighted.
Cornishman, I'm going to have to come and have a look.
I will be delighted to show you around, of course,
yeah.
and we'll be open for Heritage Open Days in September as well. So anybody is very welcome to come and have a look. Further afield, we've got some fascinating medieval churches. We've got Ormskirk Parish Church. We've got Holsall, St Cuthbert's, St Michael's in Orton, and St Luke's in Farnworth. Very good. Holy Trinity Southport is worth seeing as well. We've got some wonderful buildings. And
is the church putting on their own kind of heritage tours?
Well, yeah, the Heritage Open Days is actually a European international initiative, and it's the largest festival of free heritage events anywhere in the world. And that runs from Thursday the 8th of September to Sunday the 11th. And a lot of churches are getting involved in that, and as part of that we'll be putting on guided tours and other events. Some churches are putting on music recitals, some churches will be doing bell ringing displays. And there will be a programme for all of these coming out both on the Heritage Open Days website and also on the Diocese of Liverpool website at the beginning of September. That's great. And if people want to contact you directly, they can find your details, ian.simpson at Absolutely,
Anglican.
Yes. Yeah, liverpool.anglican.org. Yes,
okay.
right.
And well, thank you very much, Ian, for coming on the show today. It's been absolutely fascinating listening to you reflect on churches and heritage.
Well, thank you.
If, as viewers, if you want to comment or offer any suggestions, please email us at faithmatters@baytvliverpool.com. See you next time for Faith Matters.